Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. This is a webinar hosted by the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget on projecting the fiscal impact from COVID-19. As we all know, the current economic crisis and the fiscal response has dramatically expanded federal deficits. It's a topic a lot of us have been talking about, and so here to talk everyone through it today and go into our latest analysis is Marc Goldwein, our Senior Vice President and our Senior Policy Director. Marc, thanks for joining us, and why don't you go ahead and get started.
Sure. Well, I definitely appreciate everyone being here. In the spirit of social distancing, I thought we would do this webinar outside. So get on your patio or your front stairs or your backyard or whatever you have, if you have one, and join me, or just enjoy the back view of my house. Of course, this is for those that haven't done this before. This is the awkward part where we do the screen sharing. So, John, if you could pull up the slide deck for me.
Sure.
I appreciate that, and then we'll get started.
Great. I'll pull that up, and a reminder that you can use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to send in questions, and we'll try to get to them as we can. Great.
Bear with us as we pull this up. You know, it's the one thing that Zoom hasn't figured out how to do is how to seamlessly get you from your talk to your slides.
Yep.
But we're going to walk through these right now. And today's presentation is really, you know, we've done a few presentations on the response to COVID, and I'm going to spend some time talking about that. But today's presentation is really highlighting a paper that we just put out, brand new, a couple days ago, focused on what this all means for our national debt. And I think, yeah, if we'll start with this slide one right there, John. We already know, those of you that have been to one of my presentations before, know that trillions of dollars have been committed to save the economy. The Federal Reserve has committed something like $6 trillion through legislative action, administrative actions. We committed another $4 trillion. And of that $4 trillion that we've committed, you know, that's sort of the maximum amount that'll be allowed. More than half is out the door. Something like $2.2 trillion has already been sent out the door just since the crisis began. If we go to the next slide. So this is a breakdown, as many of you have seen before, of our spending by category. This is not focused on the Federal Reserve. This is only fiscal policy action. But you can see that of the amount that we've committed, a lot of it's out. Essentially, the Paycheck Protection Program, whatever we're going to spend, we've spent already, or we're going to have spent by tomorrow. The economic impact payments, those rebates that everyone's getting, most of those are out the door. Unemployment benefits are still flowing, but well along their way. Money to support Federal Reserve facilities, delay of tax filing season, money to hospitals. You can see we've spent a lot of money. Next slide, please. And by the way, this money has had a significant effect on stabilizing the economy. Now, what you're seeing here is not a graph of the economy. It's actually a graph of people's incomes, which doesn't necessarily reflect what's happened to the overall economy. The overall economy is still shrinking, or still shrunk substantially. But over the period that GDP has shrank something like 5 or 8%, income has actually been growing. Why? Because market income is way down since February, but the money that we've spent on unemployment benefits and on these rebates has more than made up for it. And so we did a little thought experiment here. If you take actual income, but you assume that people spread out their rebates over 4 months, you know, we don't consider that a month's income, we consider it 4 months income. Income in May is 7.5% higher than income in February. Think about that. That's income inclusive of people without jobs. And it appeared that the economy shrank by over 5%, income grew by over 7%. Even if we weren't to amortize these rebates, if we just were to consider them as they are, income is over 5% higher in May than in February. The point here is that the money that's going out the door is having a real effect. But that real effect, by the way, comes with a real cost. Go to the next slide. So this was annual deficits before the crisis. You can see that in 2015, we had a deficit of about $500 billion. Actually, a little lower than about $450 billion. That's high by historic standards, but that was actually somewhat sustainable. If we had continued to have deficits of $400 to $500 billion for a decade, our debt would be declining relative to the economy. Our economy would have grown fast enough to stabilize and more than stabilize the debt. But the problem is we didn't. Deficits last year were over $1 trillion, and deficits this year, even prior to the crisis, were projected to be 1.1 trillion. Deficits a decade from now were projected to rise to 1.8 trillion. That's higher than any time in history in nominal dollars. Next slide. Now remember I said, had we just kept those $500 billion deficits, $400 to $500 billion deficits, the debt would have been on an okay trajectory, at least for the medium term. And the truth is, there's no reason we could not have kept those deficits. These are old numbers you're seeing, these are old figures, but of the roughly $1 trillion deficits we were projecting per year for 2019, 2020, 2021, more than half of it is the result of recent tax cuts and spending increases. It started in the late Obama era with doc fixes and tax extenders. It got much worse in the Trump era with the 2017 tax law, with the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2018, with the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2019, and actually with more tax cuts than on top of that. This isn't just tax cuts, this is tax cuts and spending increases, none of them paid for, responsible for more than half of last year's deficit. So as a result of fiscal irresponsibility, our deficits were already high. Next slide. Now remember, these high deficits were in a period of strong economic activity, in a period that the unemployment rate was really at record lows, and that our growth, while not amazing in historical terms, was quite strong given the underlying fundamentals of the economy, given our aging population. Now we're in an economic crisis. According to the Congressional Budget Office, GDP is going to fall from above 19 trillion to below 17 trillion, and in their most recent projections is going to take a decade to recover. In nominal terms, which also includes the reduced inflation, CBO estimates we will lose about $16 trillion of economic output over the next decade. Next slide. And this has major consequences. This is that same exact slide I showed you before, but with a different scale, and you'll see why in a minute. You can see that prior to the crisis, we were facing deficits of something around $1 trillion this year. Next slide. Now, we're facing a deficit of $3.7 trillion. Our deficit is going to quadruple between 2019 and 2020, from less than $1 trillion to $3.7 trillion. It's just massive. And even next year, the deficit is projected to be above $2 trillion. Next slide. And by the way, all of that is before any new legislation. It assumes we do nothing else. But likely, and hopefully in some ways, we are going to pass some more legislation to help support the economy. We assume here about $500 billion for states and localities, about $500 billion for the unemployed. We also assume in this alternate scenario that various expiring tax provisions are extended and that appropriations continue to grow with the economy. In that case, we project the deficit this year will be 3.9 trillion. Now I should say, the 3.7 trillion number here, that's directly from the Congressional Budget Office. This is an official projection. And the 3.9 trillion is based off of that. But the Congressional Budget Office is not going to release 10-year numbers until the fall, until the beginning of September, we suspect, maybe late September. And so we've gone ahead and done our own 10-year projections based on CBO's economic projections. And based on CBO's economic projections, not only do we think that, yes, the deficit is going to approach $4 trillion this year, but we believe it is never going to fall below the $1.4 trillion record set during the Great Recession. And in fact, deficits by the end of the decade are still going to be elevated at somewhere between 1.7 and 2.4 trillion. These are our projections, which you can go ahead and visit crfb.org to see on your own in greater detail. But I'm just going to give you the headline numbers here, which is that deficits get really high as a result of the current crisis. But even assuming a steady recovery, deficits never come down to even $1 trillion, never come down to even their prior record. Next slide. Now, why does this happen? Well, it's a combination of the recession itself and the response. Both are actually very costly. So let's start with where we started. Back in March, which was after the crisis had begun, but before CBO had integrated into its estimates. CBO is estimating we'd essentially have $14 trillion of deficits over the next decade. That's a lot. That's 1.4 trillion a year on average. But the situation is now likely to be much worse. If you add up all the legislative responses as CBO has scored them, we're talking about an additional $2.4 trillion. On top of that, we estimate that the negative effects of the economy itself, the effects that it has on lower revenue, on higher payments for things like unemployment and food stamps, even offset by lower interest rates, is going to add another 2.1 trillion. And then the debt service on all that, another 1.2. So when we add all that up, we're talking about $5.7 trillion of additional debt, bringing the total from 14 trillion over a decade to almost 20 trillion over a decade. And under our alternate scenario, the situation's even worse. It would rise from about 17 trillion up to nearly 24 trillion. Next slide. And this has serious implications, not only the deficit, but the debt. Prior to the current crisis, we projected the debt was going to rise from 80% today, which is, by the way, 80% in 2019, which is higher than any time in history outside of World War II, to 97.8% by the end of the decade, which essentially meant debt was going to exceed the size of the economy sometime in the early 2030s. Next slide. Now we project, now CBO projects, debt is going to exceed the size of the economy this year. And we project it is further going to rise to 118% of GDP by 2030. The prior record, by the way, was 106%. It was set immediately after the end of World War II, just after, and we paid it back very quickly. This 118% is going to continue to rise. And by the way, this is an optimistic scenario. We go to the next slide, where we assume there's additional relief, not much, $1 trillion. I mean, $1 trillion we used to think is a much, but less than a lot of folks are talking about. We assume there's additional relief, and we assume there's further extensions of tax cuts and spending. Debt will be 130% of GDP, 131 by the end of the decade. And by the way, this sort of relatively slow debt growth path is to some degrees an artifact of the economic recovery making economic growth seem faster. Once we get past 2030, once the economy is recovered, debt is really going to take off. Next slide. And you can see that here. Two things happen here that are major after 2030 under our projections. The first is we assume the economic recovery is complete. So we're no longer benefiting from the economy growing at 2.3% per year. Instead, it's going to grow more than 1.8. And the other is the effects of the baby boom retirement and rising interest rates and rising healthcare costs are really starting to take hold. And under these projections, and I should emphasize, these are incredibly, incredibly rough. But under these 30-year projections, debt will reach 220% of GDP under current law and about 270% under our alternate scenario. There's no precedent for anything close to that. We're talking about debt levels that are twice our historic average, that are reaching or exceeding Japan's levels, and Japan already being an aberration far above any other country out there. Next slide. And if I didn't have you panicked enough about the fiscal situation and its effect on its debt, it also has a major effect on various trust funds. Even prior to this crisis, all major trust funds were projected to run out of money within 15 years or so. The Highway Trust Fund, the Disability Trust Fund, the Social Security Old Age Trust Fund, Medicare's Hospital Insurance Trust Fund, the Flood Insurance Fund, and the Pension Benefit Guarantee Multi-Employer Fund. They were all projected to run out of money within the next 15 years. We have not been able to re-estimate all of those, but we have been able to re-estimate the sort of combined Social Security Trust Fund, the Highway Trust Fund, and the Medicare Hospital Insurance. We believe the Highway Trust Fund is going to run out of money in 2021, next year. Next year, there will not be enough reserves plus gas tax revenue to finance highway spending. We believe the Medicare Trust Fund for hospital insurance will run out by 2023, and the Social Security Trust Fund on a combined basis by 2031. Think about that. That means that somebody that is a new retiree today, just turned 62, is going to be 73 years old when Social Security runs out. This isn't a program you got to save for your grandkids. It's a program you got to save for your grandparents. Next slide. Now, in case you think I'm being a little bit over concerned, I should start by saying none of this says that we need to stop borrowing today. The borrowing we're doing now is incredibly important for spreading the pain of the current pandemic and the current economic crisis over time, and for providing an additional boost to the economy when output is low. So the borrowing we do today is mostly justified. We shouldn't have started with $1 trillion deficit, but the additional money is mostly justified, and in fact, we may need more. But that doesn't mean we should keep borrowing indefinitely and into the future. It doesn't mean we don't need to worry about this path. Some people have suggested otherwise. If you visit our website, crfb.org, we try to cut through some of these myths that just, I think, give a really bad impression of what's going on with the debt. First myth suggests that we don't have to worry about the debt because interest rates are low. Low interest rates make debt costless. Now, this isn't really true for a number of reasons. First of all, interest rates, I think there's been a lot of research from Ernie Tedeschi, from folks at CBO, even from Larry Summers and others, that's really suggestive that low interest rates are where they are in spite of debt, not because of it. They're low because of what is going on with the economy in the near term, what is prospects for long-term growth, our aging of the population, changes to the financial market and international capital movement. Debt is raising interest rates. It's just other effects are lowering it. Secondly, to those who think debt is costless because the interest rate is zero, you have to remember we're still holding on to that principle. And if we're borrowing today with no plan to pay back the debt, it means that we are going to be rolling over low interest rate debt into higher interest rate debt over time. And so low interest rates today, yes, they absolutely reduce the cost of debt, but unless we have a plan to pay it back, they just delay the cost of the debt. They don't eliminate it. And then it's also important to mention that this isn't a case of one-time borrowing with sustainable structural deficits. This is the case of a long-term unsustainable structural deficits, to the point that even if the growth rate is higher than the interest rate forever, our debt is still going to be rising because just of how high our structural deficits are. We go to the next slide.
Actually, Mark, we have a quick question. Could you go into a bit of an explanation about what tax cuts you're assuming would remain in place under the alternative scenario?
Great question. So this alternative scenario is essentially jumping off of CBO's alternate fiscal scenario. And so the largest tax cuts we assume extended are the individual provisions from the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, most of which are scheduled to expire at the end of 2025, as well as full expensing. We also assume that some so-called tax extenders that we extend every couple of years, and then they die, then we bring them back from the dead, we assume they'll continue. This scenario I would say, is far from the most pessimistic scenario. There are a variety of tax cuts that are either part of the recent stimulus bill or part of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act sort of delays of tax increases that I think are likely to continue that we are not assuming. So the situation could be even worse.
Great. And another question, someone had a question about, I guess, once the trust fund is insolvent or is projected to be below where it needs to be to fully fund the program, is that really a crisis, or is it just a bit of a deficit that can be handled in other ways? I guess, how would you frame the difficult situation that Social Security and the other trust funds could be in the near term?
Well, I think the question of how much we should worry about the trust fund crises per se depends on how much you value Social Security, Medicare, and highways as self-contained programs. One of the virtues of these, both for advocates of social insurance and for fiscal responsibility, is right now Social Security is pretty much fully self-funded. It's paid out its own payroll tax. Highways are self-funded, mainly out of the gas tax. And to the extent we care about maintaining that self-funding regime, if we wait until the 2030s to fix Social Security, there will be an across-the-board benefit cut of something like 20 or 25%. It will affect everyone. It doesn't matter if you're 95 years old or 62. Doesn't matter if you're rich or poor. We want to avoid that. Now, an alternative is to abandon the self-financing. But if we abandon this self-financing, it means for advocates of kind of social insurance, these programs are now on the shopping deck, same as everything else. But B, it means that we have a lot more debt to look forward to the future, and that's embedded in the debt projections that I showed you. We have an unsustainable debt situation. Either way, it's an acute. It becomes an acute legal crisis. It's not necessarily an acute economic crisis, but I think that sharp legal crisis is the manifestation of what is a broader, more slow-moving economic crisis. If we could, I have a few more minutes, then I'm happy to answer more questions. I'll get through these pretty quick. Okay, so the second I just want to get to it is this idea that, you can go to the next slide, go ahead, that we can just reduce the debt easily. We're outside here, I'll enjoy my helicopter, but we can just reduce the debt easily like we did after World War II. You notice after World War II, debt was 106% of GDP, and basically within 10 years, debt was had been cut in half, was back to below its historic average. That's not going to be the case this time. Under our current trajectory, debt is not going to fall, it's going to continue to rise. If you go to the next slide, real quick, there just really is no way to repeat what we did after World War II. After World War II, we ran 2 decades of balanced budget. We're nowhere close to that. And we had nominal growth exceeding 6% per year, whereas we'll be lucky to get 4% nominal growth. We need a 20 trillion of deficit reduction, 6% real growth, which is 3 times what we're expecting, or 12% inflation to do what we did for World War II. That's just not happening. And if you head to this last slide, these last couple slides, the last myth here is that the Fed can just buy our debt forever. If you go to the next slide, what you'll see is that while as our debt is increased, the Fed's purchasing of debt is increased to cover about, if you go to the next slide, about 2/3 of the debt we've issued over the current crisis. That's true. You kind of see that here. And if you go to the last slide, yes, the fact that the Fed is buying our debt has helped to stabilize financial markets, but they can't do that forever. If they tried, it would drive very high inflation or end up costing us the same amount because we pay interest on reserves instead of paying interest on bonds. And to the extent that we were to avoid both, it would be by keeping interest rates artificially low in a way that could be economically damaging. So that kind of covers my presentation. At this point, I know we have a lot more questions, which I'm happy to take.
Sure, great. And as someone else asked, I forgot to verify, but yes, these slides will be available. We're going to send the slides and the recording of today's presentation tomorrow, so that'll be in your inbox if you've registered for the presentation. So another question, I think this gets to the severity of the situation if the economy actually gets worse. So basically this person is talking about would a multi-year depression or worse recession make these numbers look worse? So can you talk about what we're basing our figures on as far as CBO's economic projections and what a worsening economy could do to the debt and deficit moving forward?
So in short, the worse the economy does, the worse the budget does, and the better, and the reverse. For what it's worth, I'm hopeful that these are already relatively pessimistic. Projections. CBO basically assumes that unemployment is going to be above 10% for the next 2 years. They assume it's going to take 10 years for us to fully recover. And they assume that recovery is going to move very slow, that we're going to have some significant recovery this year or next year, but then we're basically going to slog along, growing about 2.3% instead of 1.8% until we get to recovery in 10 years. So I'm hopeful that we'll actually do better than this. But CBO's not projecting a double dip. They're not projecting the economy is going to shrink again. And if it did, it would make the situation worse, I think, in 2 ways. One is the direct way, because it would reduce the revenue that we're taking in. But the other is it would require us to enact even more legislation to support the recovery. And that legislation itself is costly. That doesn't mean that it's not worthwhile, but it's costly. And so, for every reason, we are better off with a faster growth and a faster rebound than a slower growth, especially if it can be sustained.
Okay, another question. What would happen if Congress doesn't act to extend the life of the Medicare hospitalization fund specifically?
So we've never actually let a trust fund really go past its spending period to know what would happen in reality. We have a pretty good idea what would happen with Social Security, which is what we think the law says. We know the law says Social Security is to keep paying benefits and that it can't pay more than it has in revenue. And we think what that means, the most likely scenario, is that Social Security would be required to delay its checks. And so instead of sending people monthly checks, they would send checks as there's enough money, which means that instead of 12 checks a year, you get 10 checks a year or 9 checks a year. And so technically your monthly benefit would be the same, but if you're only getting it every 6 weeks, it's the same as a 21% cut. There's an alternative theory for Social Security that at that point, the commissioner would have the authority to just cut everyone's benefits across the board to approximate that. There's a similar dynamic going on with Medicare, where we don't know. We think the most likely scenarios that what the law says is we'd actually have to delay payments to providers. Now, delaying payments to Social Security beneficiaries is really damaging because they won't have the money. But delaying payments to providers could be damaging in a different kind of way, because it could cause providers to not ever want to see Medicare patients because they know they won't get paid on time, if at all. That'd be incredibly damaging. It's also possible that CMS would have the authority at this point to just cut all the provider payments across the board, which would be damaging to providers, but probably not as disruptive as these delays. In any event, it's not pretty, which is why every time we've come close to this deadline in the past, policymakers have acted, sometimes through responsible legislation and sometimes with a bit of cheating, like moving some things that were Medicare Part A money into Medicare Part B and things like that.
All right, several other questions popping in. Let's see what we can get to next. Let's see, actually something I know you've checked out a little bit, and it was on one of your slides, which is the amount that foreign countries own some of our debt. Can you talk about which foreign countries owe the most U.S. treasuries?
Sure, and John, do you want to go back a few slides to maybe just one slide, actually? I think a few slides. I think we had this.
Wrong one, sorry.
This right here, but something about the data on our debt is it is delayed. So the data I'm going to show you now is from April, even though we're in June. But we don't have a reason to think it's dramatically different, which is essentially over the course of the the COVID recession, total foreign holdings of debt have shrunk slightly. They have not increased. I mean, as our debt has grown by about $3 trillion. Foreign holdings have actually shrunk a little bit. They've mainly shrunk among petro countries that have large amounts of oil, because those countries are poorer because the value of oil has gone down so much. Our two largest debt holders, China and Japan, continue to each hold about the same amount of debt, but a smaller proportion. They were holding 10%, now it's like 7% each, not because they've reduced their debt holdings dramatically, but because they haven't increased as we have. Our excess debt has come primarily from the Federal Reserve buying more debt. They don't buy directly, they buy indirectly, but it's still the effect. And secondarily from increased domestic holdings, which we think are largely in money market accounts, which means basically people are saving a lot more money in the bank. I mean, we know this from the data, consumption is way down even as income is up. People, after transfer income is up, people are saving way more money they are putting in the bank. Banks are using this money to buy very, very short-term treasuries, very, very short-term bills of 1 month or 3 months. And we think that represents most of the domestic holdings here. That's not going to be sustainable over the long run. Eventually, people are going to want to spend again or going to have to spend again because their income is going to be so high, and there won't be such a deep pool of domestic savings. At that point, the question is the Federal Reserve going to expand its balance sheet even more? Or do we have to start to, I don't want to say beg, but are we going to have to go to other countries and ask for more lending from them, and will they give it? That's an unknown at this point. And what will we have to pay for it, I should say.
Great. I'm going to do a little bit of moderator prerogative and take two good questions we have and combine them into one because I think they're related. So one, I assume tied to the Social Security question, or it could just be tied to how we pay for just all the debt in general, which is why don't we just increase the payroll tax? Or another person asked, well, what do you think about tax reform, the outlook for that, changes to the corporate tax, et cetera? So Mark, talk about tax changes and tax reform that you think maybe policymakers should be thinking about here.
Yeah, so I think that we absolutely need to look at raising the payroll tax, both to help finance Social Security shortfall, and we should consider it for Medicare shortfall as well. The problem with the payroll tax is if you raise the rate, it is to some degree regressive. It affects everyone, including low-income workers and including the middle class. You can raise the tax max, the amount of income subject to the payroll tax. That affects only higher income people. but it's a much bigger tax increase, and it kind of limits your tax capacity. You can only do that so many times. I think we should consider both. And if you look at bills like John Larson's Social Security 2100, it does both. But we're not going to be able to solve the entire, as a political matter, we're not going to be able to solve all of Social Security just by raising payroll taxes. And as a practical and economic matter, if we did, it would severely limit our capacity to raise taxes for other important purposes. And so I'm not sure it would be the best way. And so we're probably going to want to look at a combination of changes to the payroll tax and changes to the benefit formula, and maybe changes to the retirement age and other things like that. And in Medicare, obviously, reducing overall healthcare costs. If you go to our socialsecurityreformer.org, you can actually design your own Social Security reform plan for whatever mix of payroll tax and benefit changes you want. As for tax reform, I think I'll say one good thing about the tax reform we just passed. Before I launch my complaints, one good thing is I do think people entered this crisis with a bit more income, and that was helpful from the weather. And a bit more income because they had a short period of time where they are having lower taxes, and so they had probably a bit more savings. But we kind of wasted a lot of fiscal capacity for a tax reform that wasn't overall that pro-growth. We could have easily gotten the same amount of growth we got from the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act through a revenue-neutral tax reform. In fact, if you look at the original House Better Way plan, it was both more pro-growth and more fiscally responsible to a significant degree. And the fact that we wasted $2 trillion on tax cuts that probably had a positive but very limited effect on growth, I think it's evident now how wasteful that is, knowing that we really need that $2 trillion to help support and get us through this current crisis. And I think what we're learning is we really made a big mistake to spend that much in the tax cuts, and by the way, to spend that much in the subsequent spending bills, when we should have been holding our fiscal capacity for real needs like today's crisis.
Okay, another question. So it's obviously not our main area of expertise, but something we've been following closely. How do you see the COVID-19 recession and everything impacting state budgets?
Yeah, so states are in big trouble. In some ways, expenses will go up for states. They're going to do a lot more to safeguard their workers, to figure out how to make the schools safe, et cetera. They will get some savings for things that they don't have to operate as much because of social distancing. But the real issue with states where they're really going to have to face some troubles is with their revenue. Sales tax revenue is going to be, and is already, I assume, through the floor due to the periods of shelter in place and business shutdowns and social distancing even in the recovery period. Income tax revenue is going to suffer and is suffering as a result of unemployment. And probably on a lag, property tax revenue is going to suffer as well. And so states are in big trouble. And even states that were really good with their rainy day funds, they were prepared for rainy days. They weren't prepared for 6 hurricanes, all in the same season, which is essentially what we're facing. And so I do think we're going to provide some support to the states. We have done a bit already, increasing their Medicare rates, giving them money for COVID-specific purposes, giving them a bit more for education. But depending on how you measure it, we've probably given them something like $100 to $200 billion of unrestricted money, whereas their shortfalls over the next 3 years, if you account for states and localities, we're probably talking about $500 billion to $1 trillion. My gut is on the lower end of that side, but different estimates have different things. The federal government should not be in the business of bailing out states for past bad behavior. And I think there's an argument we shouldn't even be covering the entirety of their COVID-related losses. But if we don't cover any of these losses, states are going to do a lot of furloughs and layoffs and tax increases that are going to end up weakening the economic recovery. And you're going to have state and local workers competing against private sector workers for the same jobs. And so I think it is really important that we look at ways that federal aid can help states and localities, again, without trying to bail them out for past irresponsibility. The best time to do that would be in the next 2 days before the state fiscal year ends. Realistically, states aren't like businesses or small businesses or households. They can last a little longer, but sooner rather than later, we're going to need to consider additional aid packages.
Okay, got another question here. You talk all the time about how even when rates are low, borrowing isn't free. So talk about, someone had a question of whether Treasury should sell longer term bonds, 50-year, 100-year, and so on, given the
Yeah,
current.
so I think it is worth the Treasury looking into selling longer term bonds to lock in today's low rates over a longer period of time. One caveat to remember is if we're selling 50 or 100-year bonds, we're going to pay a much higher rate than what we're paying right now in the short-term bonds. So we are actually accepting higher cost. But if we lock it in now, we don't have to roll it over for a longer period of time. And so I think that's worth considering. And prior to this crisis, we had been transitioning to a bit more longer maturity schedules, and we may do that again. But it's also important to look at the data to try to figure out who actually wants to buy these bonds. Because right now, the Federal Reserve is buying several 100% of all long-term bonds on net. In other words, the Federal Reserve is buying more long-term bonds than the Treasury is issuing, which means on net, we are issuing negative long-term bonds, at every auction. And so the fact that the interest rate on the 30-year bond is something like 1.6% or I'd have to check 1.6%, may not be that meaningful because nobody's buying it. If your bond is 1.6%, but nobody's buying it, is it really 1.6%? And so I suspect if we did try to move substantially to long-term bonds, we'd actually have to raise that rate above what it is today. Still maybe well lower than what we'll get in the future, but we can't expect too much from today's low rates. And lastly, I'd say this isn't a free lunch. You're just kicking the can down the road 50, 30 or 50 or 100 years. And side note, I don't think there's really almost any demand for 100-year bonds. But is it worth kicking the can to reduce interest rate risk? In some cases, yes, but not if you trick yourself into thinking you've solved the problem. The only way you solve the problem is by getting your structural deficit under control.
Great. I think we have time for just a couple more questions. One of them is someone was asking about low inflation interest rates even before the crisis, whether that had anything to do with the gap in wealth. I don't know if you know anything about that, but you have done some research on why inflation and interest rates haven't been as high as maybe some would have anticipated.
There is some evidence that suggests that part of the reason that interest rates are so low is related to income inequality and what effect it has on sort of consumption versus savings decisions. And so income inequality is somewhere between a likely and probable factor, but not a definite factor of low interest rates. I don't think it's as high on the list as declines in projected productivity, aging of the population, more open international capital markets. So I think there's other explanations we look at that are larger, but rising inequality probably is a factor. On the lower inflation, I think also, international trade puts downward pressure, but ironically, the Federal Reserve in some ways did too good a job with its own credibility. And so people don't expect inflation to rise, even if the Fed says it will, because they know they're going to keep it under control. And so that's a factor as well with low inflation. Interest rates have, I should say, really been on a 50-year downward trajectory. It's been up and down, but 50 years downward. But if you look over the long history, they've had very long periods of climbing and very long periods of declining, and very long periods of climbing again. And so the fact that interest rates have been declining for a very long time doesn't mean they'll continue to decline, and we won't see another period of them rising again, particularly as both US and global debt continues to rise so dramatically. And if eventually risk premium become attached to those debt. In other words, if our debt is at some point viewed as no longer a safe bet.
All right, well, it's been great. I figure, so one of the first questions that came in, I thought I'd save it for last, is given these numbers that you're sharing and how eye-popping they are you seeing an increased awareness from lawmakers, people in charge, about the severity of this problem and the fact that they need to tackle it at some point?
So I think most lawmakers are rightly focused on how do we address the current crisis. That is the right thing they should be doing. But increasingly, we are seeing more lawmakers as a secondary issue start to think about, okay, what do we do when this crisis passes? And in fact, there was a great letter signed by 60 members of the House, 30 Democrats, 30 Republicans, including Arrington and Peters, who led it, Representatives Arrington and Peters, on ways that we can start to set up the right processes and institutions to deal with this crisis at the appropriate time. And they suggested we do three things in one of these rescue packages. One, we consider something like a fiscal state of the nation, where every year the head of the GAO reports on our fiscal situation. So this is just to raise awareness. Number two, we look in some type of commission that could address issues like long-term trust fund insolvency, like the Romney Mansion Trust Act and fiscal policy. And number three, we start to set up the budget process to include debt to GDP targets. So we have long-term goals for what to reach for. None of these are policies that would try to reduce deficits today or take focus away from rescuing the economy, stabilizing the economy, and improving the public health situation, which should be the focus. But these are the types of policies that, as we are focused on taking our way slowly out of this economic and public health crisis, we can also make sure there's a future focus on addressing our rising debt and almost insolvent trust funds. And we all know we're going to do this sooner rather than later. So let's hope we do it sooner.
Great. All right, Mark. Well, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it. Thank you for everyone who attended today. As mentioned, we will send the slides and the recording of the presentation around. So thank you again. We appreciate it. And everyone have a great day.
Thank you.